What is up?
Greetings. Hi. How you doing?
Good. How are you, Jake?
Good.
Long time no see.
Long time no see. It's nice to greet the virtual emanation of you.
How
And
you
all
been
this is
doing?
like, it's like we don't exist really anymore. Just these like virtual avatar versions of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's what self-isolation is, right?
I guess, yeah.
You're your digital being. That's about it right now.
That's all we got. We got to work with it
It's all an illusion anyway.
for sure.
Alrighty. So for everyone joining, hi, welcome. So, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
My name is Jake Kobrin. I am a multidisciplinary artist, a painter, a musician, DJ. Um, kind of just doing a lot of different creative things, and I'm passionate about creativity. I like learning and being creative. And living in Bali currently, it's where I am now. Probably best known for my psychedelic artwork, visual artwork, paintings. Yeah, tattoo artist. How was that?
Tat-
Was that a good introduction?
That's a great introduction. I don't think it does you justice because you're probably like one of the dopest people I've ever met. So,
Cool.
yeah.
Thank you.
So,
Well, if you want
all
to
right.
introduce,
Introduce me.
yeah,
Okay.
tell my audience.
Hi, my name is Claire. I go by the name ClairVoyage. I live in Kansas currently, attending my final year at the Kansas City Art Institute. Um, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, but I primarily paint, but I'm also an art historian. And a lot of the work that I'm doing currently is in movements that don't actually have any academic basing, particularly visionary art. But I'm also really interested in medical principles and how these things can actually explain depictions, or how medical events influence cultural art historical movements. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit today, but like way cooler, I promise.
Cool. Yeah,
Hopefully.
sounds great.
Yeah, be awesome. So basically, I'm working on my senior thesis paper right now. Very early stages, but it's going to come along quickly. Um, Basically, what it's over is I'm examining depictions specifically of a state of ego death. So I'm looking at this state in different, um, from different reasons, right? So whether that's through psychedelics, or that's through deep meditation, or through some kind of yoga practice, because ego death can happen in many ways. But a lot of my research currently is in neuroscience and how the parts of the brain are explaining this phenomenon known as ego death. So, what is causing this feeling? And then I'm going to relate that to specific examples from various different artists that are depicting this state. So, connecting those two, trying to build a bridge, to really kind of not necessarily explain it because it doesn't need explained, but to kind of give some substantial backing for people who may not really understand it. Um, yeah, it's kind
Amazing.
of like a gateway. Yeah, so
Cool.
it's pretty interesting. So
Yeah.
we're talking to you about artworks that you've had that depict an ego death. All right. So I guess my first question for you is how would you define the ego?
I think the ego is the limited concept of ourselves, the self that is isolated from infinity, from unity, from wholeness. I think in our essence we are actually one with the totality, but in order to function for whatever reason, to play these roles that we we have to adopt these characters, which we are trained to believe are separate from this larger self. And as you've probably researched, you know that there are means to reach an expanded state of consciousness in which your perception of self isn't limited only to this small sense of self, but instead includes the totality, and that's what we call an ego death. But it's really just a reorientation of perception to what you define as yourself.
Hmm. Okay. So, do you think that that separation of self, um, so I guess I wonder what your take is on why this happens in some experiences and not in others. Like, how would you differentiate this, like a true ego death in one of these experiences from just another psychedelic state?
Well, the relaxing of the ego can occur over many different sort of stages or levels. So, for example, because yeah, our definitions of ourselves include not only us as individuals, but it also includes our communities, our associations with particular groups or cultures and things like that. So, for example, one type of ego death is that you could begin to not only identify with a particular group or nation, like I'm an American, and instead see yourself as part of the whole human community. You know, like, oh, I realize that the nation identity is just some arbitrary boundary that is drawn, and that we actually are all connected, and that we're all a part of this one global family, and that in itself is an ego death, even though you still are even though you still have a perception of yourself as a separate entity, still it's kind of starting to whittle down the boundaries that exist between yourself and other. So that's something that usually occurs if people take psychedelics. I think that it's rare for somebody to undergo a psychedelic experience and to not have a broadening of their identity than the opposite, you know. In terms of the full sort of ego death, which is like a, I guess I would consider a full ego death an experience and you have no awareness moment of existing as a separate self. So you're just completely kind of blown out. It is like being dead in a way. There is awareness that exists still, but the identity and the story and the narrative and the boundaries of your self and your individuality in accordance with everything else doesn't exist anymore. I think that there's different factors as to why those types of experiences only exist in certain uh, circumstances. I think it has to do with the what particular medicine you may be taking or how much you're taking, and also how primed one's consciousness is to be able to let go fully enough for something like that to happen, because that can be something that is actually very frightening and very scary to undergo, because it also it inherently includes a complete and total lack of control. So that's really difficult for people to surrender into. And so there's often like a knock at the door for that experience to, it has a potential to occur, but people fight it, you know, and that's sometimes where people get triggered into what's called a bad trip, because they start clinging onto the fear of their mortality rather than just kind of being like, oh, it's all right, I can die now, it's okay.
Okay. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that this idea of ego death, like, it's kind of a theory that ego has developed over time. Like, it's something that as a culture we've kind of adopted as like how things should work.
Yeah,
To
probably true.
And then this dissolution is because we are connected with this thing that we are supposed to have but have lost. So I think that a lot of that, particularly in my experience, is that anxiety or that fear. That is just the anxiety of being disconnected from what we're told that we have to be.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
Um, so
It's a
I'm
trick of perception because we're actually one with that totality all the time. And the separation that we perceive is just a trick of our consciousness. It's an illusion that we perceive. So ego deaths even can occur spontaneously without the need for any kind of meditation practice or to ingest a psychedelic or anything. It's just when you can sufficiently make that shift in your consciousness to realize that you're a part of this much bigger thing. That could happen, for example, looking up at the stars on a clear night or something like that. Anything that kind of puts you in contact with that great mystery, that overwhelming sense of awe and wonder and the hugeness, the vastness of the universe that we're a part of, that can trigger these kinds of experiences.
Yeah. So I'm wondering for you on a physical level, how would you describe that an ego death feels? Like we've kind of covered mentally what this is feeling like, um, but do you ever have physical effects?
Well, I mean, the physical effects of having an ego death is that it's like being a river, is how I could describe it, because you're you're feeling flooded by all these different sensations, but there's no container around it, you know? So in those moments, you can't even say like, oh, I feel sad or I feel happy or I feel tingling. It's just ecstasy where you are, I mean, even the concept of I have a body and, it's like when I've had those types of experiences, I don't even, all of the conceptual narratives that we use to kind of use as a compass to understand our experience are just gone. So who I am, who I've been, what my name is, where I am, um, what is happening, if I've taken something, all these kinds of things are just they're completely out of the window in those moments. So I would say physically, all I can say is it's ecstatic, it's intense, it's pleasurable, it's kind of orgasmic, I guess like an orgasm is actually a kind of ego death, or can be, at least in its own way. So there's some similarity there, but it's a little bit more intense, a little bit more potent also.
Yeah. So would you say that this state specifically, um, like early on when you were experimenting with these states and with psychedelics, was this state something that carried on after that experience, or was it something that kind of ended and you were trying to understand?
Yeah, those kinds of experiences through both meditation and through psychedelics have completely reoriented my perception of reality. That of course I have an ego like anybody else. It's necessary for whatever reason to function in the way that we have structured our society in this time. But I do feel like I have kind of a background awareness of all times, also of the sort of totality and unity of the world that we, or the universe that we exist in. And I used to be like very depressed, and I think that a lot of depression and a lot of mental and emotional and psychological suffering inherently comes out of this illusion of separateness and this kind of unnecessary pressure and weight that we put upon ourselves as individuals. So it was very healing for me when I had this first kind of ego death experience. It really helped to, melt gently these kinds of rough, abrasive edges that were threatening me, you know?
Yeah.
Because I guess that you become less identified and you put less pressure on what we have to do as individuals. All this kind of question about what do I need to do with my life, it's so heavy, it's so weighty. Whereas if you realize that the the life that we have is just part of this infinite continuum of life itself, which is doing fine no matter what, then there's nothing really to stress about, because the intelligence of nature and life is so great. And for us to think that our small minds, which have such a limited amount of intelligence compared to that great intelligence, can control that or are somehow better. It's like your 7-year-old kid, like just needing to hold the wheel of your car or something like that. You know what I mean? It's like, that's why they say, let Jesus take the wheel. I'm just joking about that. But, the
Happy
concept,
Easter.
happy Easter. But yeah, the concept about basically just trusting in the greater intelligence of God, of nature, of whatever you want to call it, because if it can develop this astoundingly complex system that we call the universe, then I'm pretty sure that it's going to be able to figure out my place in it too.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you've done I'm sure you've done research on the neuroscience of psychedelics. Um, what are your theories on particularly what would be happening in the brain during an ego death? Do you have any?
Yeah, my understanding is that it's the prefrontal cortex that creates those boundaries and separations. And in
Mm-hmm.
Western culture, we have a particularly, I guess, maybe not just Western culture, but humans as we exist now have a particularly developed prefrontal cortex. And it's a protection mechanism that was necessary at a certain point in our evolution to be developed for our survival. And the prefrontal cortex, it deals with these boundaries and separations and discernment and dissection, which is why there's so much emphasis in scientific research and scientific thought, because science is all about analyzing and dissecting. So that's kind of how our brains are wired as modern humans, and psychedelics basically turn off the prefrontal cortex. So it eliminates that boundary creating mechanism within the brain. And when you turn off the boundary creating mechanism in the brain, but there's still consciousness, awareness, presence that exists, then all you have left is just boundarylessness, interconnectedness. And that is fundamentally what psychedelics do for people. They do a lot of different things in a lot of different circumstances, but in general, they dissolve boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you familiar with Dr. Robin Carhart Harris by chance?
The name is very familiar. I believe he works with Johns Hopkins University. Is that correct?
He works at the Imperial College of London
Okay.
currently. But
Okay.
he's doing a lot of really groundbreaking stuff in terms of psilocybin research and
Mm.
also other psychedelics. And one of the things that I've been researching a lot is what is happening in the brain, very specifically when people take high doses of psilocybin. So the studies that they're doing are pretty, like, they dose them up pretty hard. I'm not even going to lie to you. And basically what they've found is that the default mode network in the brain, which is the posterior singular cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the thalamus, this region of the brain is responsible for introspection. So the ego, things like that. They find that in the state under psilocybin, blood flow and energy is actually decreased to the default mode network. So what's happening is that in depression, there's actually more flow to this area. So that when there's less flow, there's less introspection. Well, typically things with like the hippocampus, which deals with your external view of the world and how you relate to it, rather than the default mode network is the internal dialogue. These typically fire pretty much competitively. And you can tell by the order of how they're firing, they don't really fire together. But what happens on psilocybin is not only the blood flow is decreased to the default mode network, which deals with yourself, but it tends to fire with your hippocampus, which is causing this blurring of ego, right? So that's how they're theorizing, obviously, that this dissolution of ego and what we would consider an ego death is happening, and how they would explain it. Because the people who had the lower levels of blood flow to the default mode network rated their experience as pretty much complete dissolution of ego, which I thought was pretty fascinating. Because there's not a lot of research.
Have they found that, have they done any studies that kind of can locate the ego within a particular part of the brain, or is it the interaction of these different parts?
So it's the interaction of a lot of different parts. So there's actually one theory that I've kind of been studying that's called the holographic theory. Have you, you know what that is?
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
I'm gonna,
basically,
yeah.
you explain it.
Do you want me to explain it, or do you want to?
Yeah, you explain it.
Okay, so basically with a true hologram, you only need one particle of light that carries all the information for the entire hologram. So, right, that's why they call it the holographic theory. But the theory is that this happens on every single level of the universe, right? So you only need one of your cells, theoretically, that carries all the information to recreate your entire body. Well, their theory with the brain is that you only need one neuron to be able to recreate you, because they don't think that memories are stored in any one place. Right? They think that it's a combination of electrical signals in your brain, right? Just like if you have a traumatic brain injury, your brain will redirect to heal around the injury a lot of times, and a lot of times things they're like, oh, like they shouldn't be able to like talk. Your brain, because it's electrical signals, can basically rewire itself and teach itself how to do that again. So that's the holographic theory. So they don't actually think that you are stored in any one place in your brain, per se, because you are all of your brain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've heard things such as they've studied memory because they've tried to locate where memory is stored in the brain, and they've I don't know how exactly, but they've like turned off certain parts of the brain to try to identify it, and they've found that even people that have physical injuries to particular parts of their brain, it doesn't limit their memory. So it's like the hologram of the memory is stored in all the different parts of the brain. Yeah, it's very interesting because there's not any real convincing understanding of consciousness that has been arrived at through scientific research into the brain yet. And there's actually no scientific basis that shows that consciousness even originates in the brain. That's an assumption that is made a lot in Western thinking, but it's not. I mean, the brain could just as well be a kind of receiver for consciousness, like an antenna, and consciousness is something that exists outside of us than is generated within our bodies or our brains.
Yeah, so that's something that is also really interesting in terms of this topic is that I think that the visions that are channeling in this state are not you. Because when you're having visions in this state and you're aiming to portray them, what is your opinion on where those come from? Because I'm because that's one interesting thing is like the paper itself is about death essentially is like when the artist dies and they receive a vision, right? They have this physical change in their brain, they have a vision, and then they paint this vision and the ego is gone. Who, what is it
Well,
about?
it's a mystery as to where creative ideas originate from in general. Like when somebody writes a song, where does that song come from? I was watching this like masterclass with David Lynch, the filmmaker, recently, and he talks about it. His metaphor is it's like catching a fish. You kind of throw out your hook, and then you catch an idea. But he prescribes this practice that you're essentially just kind of sitting around doing nothing and letting ideas kind of swim into your consciousness. Personally, I definitely am oriented to believe that ideas and insights originate from something external, that we're kind of if we have an open enough consciousness, we're able to catch things from, perhaps it's the collective unconscious, or it could be ancestral, it could be from our DNA. It's very mysterious where those things come, but it definitely originates from a source that is outside of you. And probably the the works of art that I've had a direct part in, that I've helped create, I have been most astounded by those works of art when I'm creating them. It seems like I'm not there, and there's not a lot of rational, analytical thought that goes into the process of creating them. And then afterwards, when it's manifested, I look at that work of art and I kind of am I'm sort of astounded by it. And I don't even think it's egotistical to say that I'm astounded by it, because I am astounded by it the way an archaeologist could make some kind of discovery, because I don't really think I have that much to do with that work of art that has been created. It's like I have a particular skill set that allows me to receive and then translate these visions or insights or ideas, but I'm not the one that is coming up with this stuff.
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, it's a really good description of that, Jake. Leaving me speechless. It looks like we do have a question.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on the origin and dynamic of disincarnate entities or DMT entities and the interaction thereof? Ideas or theories of the source? Question mark.
I think it's very possible that we have a very limited set of perception, being three-dimensional or four-dimensional beings, and that there are infinite dimensions that exist. And I'm completely open to the possibility that there are intelligent entities that are non-corporeal, that exist, that we can interact with in certain states of consciousness. And I know that that's not a very popular idea, because most people are kind of agnostic or atheistic, and that's hard to test, but there is a prevalence of that within all of human history. And this book, Supernatural by Graham Hancock, is awesome, and it really explores that. Basically shows that whether you want to call it fairies or aliens or spirits or whatever, there is a precedent, or machine elves, there is a precedent interaction of humanity with these other dimensional beings for all of human history. Like from the earliest recordings of human civilization up until now. The terminology has shifted somewhat as culture has shifted and people's perceptions has evolved, but yet there's always been that thing.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, specifically what you think the state of ego death has in common and what is different from actual death, like what we would consider death in Western culture.
Well, it's really impossible to know exactly what death is as a living being unless somebody, I suppose, has physically died and that's been tested and verified and then brought back to life through medical means. Um, I guess that, Terence McKenna has a story about how he gave a monk who was a Buddhist monk, like a Tibetan Buddhist monk, DMT, and that monk said when he came back, oh, that was the Bardo realm. That's as far as you can get into death without, you know, without actually physically leaving your body. So I would think that that person would be a credible source to at least say that there is a similarity between these kinds of high dose psychedelic experiences and death. I believe at the very least that having these kinds of experiences has prepared me somewhat for whatever that moment will be like when I actually do need to leave my body, because it has at least given me an understanding that I am not this body, that there is something way greater, you know? So, yeah, I would think that it's similar. That's all I can say.
Say that it's similar.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. They're after many Bardas. Okay. Would you consider the state of ego death a visionary state? Why or why not?
Yeah. Well, I've not really experienced much with 5-MeO DMT, and many people report ego death type experiences through that particular substance. And most people report that those experiences are not visionary, actually. That it's more of an experience of overwhelming light, like white light, just endless, infinite light. When I've had visionary experiences with psychedelics, there's a tendency for there to still be a kind of mental component, almost like the narrator is what I could call it. Part of my mind that can at least still say like, whoa, or something like that. But when I've had ego death experiences, that narrator is gone. It's like complete dissolving into either a void-like state. And the visions generally come when when the ego starts to reconstitute. That's when those visions have a tendency to emerge. So I guess that I wouldn't say that the ego death experiences that I've had have actually really been particularly visionary. You know, it's it's usually sort of like a void type experience,
Hmm. All
and
right.
it could be preceded by visions. You know, like there could be visions as well, but those two things don't generally happen at the same time.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a really good insight. I know particularly the ego death experiences that I've had that were like I could like count, like entire dissolution, right? Is almost like nothing. There is nothing because you are nothing. Like you
Yeah.
can't define you. It's so boundaryless that there is no definition to a thing. So trying to comprehend that state, I understand what you're getting at there. Um,
Yeah,
how would you
there still needs to be that receiver of information, and that information is often visual. You take the receiver away, and then then there is no information. It's just, yeah, like this guy said, it's nothing but everything, for sure.
Yeah, awesome. How would you say that these, what you would consider like ego death visions or coming from that state, when you're coming to relate to the rest of your work?
Well, when I was sort of at the beginnings of my psychedelic exploration, after I had my first kind of ego death experience, I participated in a group show in San Francisco that was called Memento Mori. And Memento Mori means remember your mortality. It's a Latin term. And the work of art that I created for that show, all of the works of art in that show were related around the theme of death. And I created a sort of skeleton that was made uh, of of eyes that were kind of like flowing in and out of that skull. I don't even know if I really even have a photograph of it because it was sort of the first work of art that I created that was directly inspired by a psychedelic experience. But what I was trying to communicate through that work of art is the consciousness is eternal and the body is what dies. So I think that there are, and there have been other works of art that I have created. I mean, a lot of my artwork actually that is based around that transcendental experience of oneness, of unity, of the death of the individual into something larger. It's also expanded my capacity, I think, to meditate and to go into the kind of trance that is necessary to realize really great works of art. It's changed my state of consciousness, my default state of consciousness to an extent that it's influenced my process of creativity, I think, significantly.
Perfect. Um, so I have a few other questions. Can you elaborate on maybe some certain, like, particular experiences that you've had? Do you feel comfortable doing that?
Sure. Well, the first time I took mushrooms was very significant for me. I was 17 or 18 at the time and hadn't had any prior psychedelic experience, but I had experience in meditation. And in meditation, I had experiences that were at least expanded consciousness. They weren't necessarily ego death experiences, but I had been living for many, many, many years within the confines of my mind, which was just kind of endless chatter. And when I actually sat down to meditate, that voice in my mind, that kind of just antagonizing inner narrative started to quiet down. So I already had some very subtle ego death type experiences. But when I took mushrooms the first time, I took a decent dose and I took it by myself using the kind of MAPS protocol, which is just to have a sleep mask by myself with music playing. I wasn't at a rave or something. And I just remember basically dissolving into a sort of oceanic type consciousness that was like ecstasy. Like I was crying, I was laughing uncontrollably, and I didn't really know what was going on. I was just sort of taken by this experience that I dissolved into this river and was just kind of taken by the flood of experiences. And I didn't remember who I was, where I was, what my name was, you know, what day it was, like had I just taken something. All these kinds of concepts were just gone. I was just awareness, and I guess that awareness you could call love. And it reminded me that this is who I actually am. This is who we all are. And all of these kinds of ideas about ourselves, like I had a narrative about being dark, about, you know, I kind of perceived myself being this sort of misanthropic and tortured soul, and, you know, I was all emo and dark and whatever. I realized that was just total fiction. It was a construct of my mind. And I remembered even when I was a little kid, it reminded me of some of my earliest memories before I had really taken on an identity, before I had come up with this story about myself. And I was just, yeah, free, liberated, this little like I was just light, you know? Because I do think, I think kids live in that state, you know, and it's like afterwards that we construct these prisons that we live within. And it was a liberating experience. It was a life-changing experience, you know, that dramatically influenced my perceptions on myself and reality. It was very healing psychologically and emotionally, and very spiritually connecting. And for months afterwards, I didn't I wasn't taking psychedelics regularly at that time, you know, and for at least 3 months after that experience, I still felt that, you know, I still felt connected. It was beautiful.
Yeah, another question I had that's kind of related to that last statement was like, when you experience this state, like it is so transcendental, but I find that like almost like, I don't know, like a numbing cream of ego, it like eventually wears off. Like, do you find that the more that you practice with these medicines, the less and less that wear off happens? Or do you think that it's something that you have to kind of rework with and reapply?
I think there's generally held wisdom within the psychedelic community, especially by older practitioners, that psychedelics in themselves don't help you to reach expanded states of consciousness. They give you insights and experiences which can accelerate the growth of your consciousness, but you need to have some kind of regular practice within your life that helps to stabilize those insights. Otherwise, you don't really get anywhere. And people sometimes even harm themselves by continual use without proper integration. So I don't, yeah, I definitely experience what you're talking about, but I do think that it's become stabilized over time because I have a pretty consistent meditation practice, and I do breath work and journaling and yoga and a lot of other things that help to integrate those experiences. And also the art. The art is definitely a way for me to try to concretize those insights into a powerful visual image that I can relate to. I can see that image and I can feel what it was that I felt in that time. And other people can too. There's a window of time that you need to kind of act on after these powerful experiences to create a work of art so that people can so that you, while you're still in that state, can capture it, you know. And it's usually about 2 or 3 weeks after the experience.
Yeah. Um, so I know you had initially sent me some work that when I said visions from the state of ego death, you had one in particular. Is that the body that's like orange yellow? Or is that what you're like currently working on?
No, I had sent you an image that I had made that was called blast off ego side, and it's, yeah, I mean, a lot of the works of art that I create, they kind of come through without much prior conceptual deliberation, and this one was no different, but it to me really did capture that kind of the feeling of being just completely blown apart and your ego being shattered and you dissolving into this greater thing.
Cool.
It wasn't based off of a particular experience necessarily.
Okay. All right. So you would say that typically pretty much all, I mean, I don't know. I would kind of argue that every kind of art that can fall in this like visionary category is talking about this state of ego death. Because one of the things that's really big in our community, I would say, is this state of flow. And anytime you're in flow, you're kind of taking a back seat to what is being channeled rather than driving, or so to
Yeah.
say. Yeah. How would you say that the act of painting is related to like a psychedelic ego death?
Well, I've had many experiences. They're really some of the most awesome experiences of my life. Some of the ones I've enjoyed the most, where you, through a creative process, whether that's painting or tattooing or music or whatever, you get into a place where you're not really thinking about what you're doing, and instead you're taken over by some greater force that seems to be guiding your hand in the process. That's been is the best feeling. And yeah, that's what people call like a flow state. And a flow state is an ego death because you're not focused upon yourself in the act of creating. Instead, you're just completely immersed within the creative process.
Mm-hmm.
So
Interesting.
I would say that actually a creative practice like painting or like writing or like drawing or whatever it is, dancing for many people, is actually a way to access an ego death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very cool. Very, very cool. That pretty much answered all my questions. I think that that was a pretty comprehensive take on ego death, psychedelics, and how they relate to your work specifically. Unless you have anything here you want to add. Anything
Not
right now?
necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, no, that was good. I like hearing you talk. I
Thanks. I
like
like hearing you talk too.
knowledge.
I'd love to learn more about the brain science behind all this. I know actually very little about that. Do you want to maybe open up for a second to see if does anybody have any questions for either of us? Anybody
Yeah,
that's
it looks like there was a question in the little question thing. Do either of you have any recommendations on books or podcasts that discuss healing through psychedelics or dot dot dot? I can't see the rest of the question.
sure.
Um, yeah, you can start with that one.
Well, I mean, Be Here Now by Ram Dass is kind of quintessential when it comes to the effects of psychedelics upon one's spiritual journey and healing. Um, yeah, podcasts. Yeah, any podcast with Rick Doblin. He's the founder of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He's been on Joe Rogan's podcast a few times. Yeah, there's a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide by James Fadiman that dives pretty deeply into the healing side of psychedelics, and also a book called The Secret Chief Revealed, which was written about a underground psychedelic therapist named Leo Zed. And yeah, those are good places to start. I generally listen to I like Aubrey Marcus podcast. He has a lot of podcasts about the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics. Duncan Trussell's podcast, he tends to have some guests that are in that realm, and Joe Rogan's podcast as well, of course.
Yeah, yeah, super good. So I have a few book recommendations about kind of like more generally this topic, but someone asked about, so she finished off that question and it was discuss healing through creating with psychedelics or multidimensional reality. And one of my favorite books ever is The Invisible Landscape, Mind, Hallucinogens, and the Itching by Dennis and Terrence McKenna.
Yeah, that's classic.
Good. You guys should all read this. If you're still watching, please read that book. So good.
You want a novelty spike beyond the exponential curve and the eschaton.
Yeah. Timothy Leary, The Psychedelic Experience. LSD and the Divine Scientist. You already said Be Here Now. The Mission in Art, also a classic.
Yeah. That's great.
This is important. You guys all have to read this if you haven't already. Another one, my brother recommended this book. I haven't personally read it, but he was on here. I don't know if he's still watching, but he recommended When Plants Dream by Daniel Pinchbeck. What was the first one that I said? Someone asked.
It was The Invisible Landscape by Dennis and Terrence McKenna.
Yes. You can screenshot. Right meow. Anyway, he recommended that.
Also, Terrence, what's it called? Food of the Gods goes into very deeply the effects of psychedelics on the evolution of human consciousness. And that also relates to creativity and art and culture in general, and language specifically.
Yeah. Um, and this might just be me, but I know that I'm a little bit wound tight with a lot of things, and I'm really interested, like I said, in like the medical science things behind all this. I know none of it can actually be explained, but I kind of like to know like what's going on in my head, right? Like when these things are happening. So I definitely recommend listening or reading anything by Dr. Robin Carhart Harris, Imperial College of London. His research is incredible. The way that he voices it is incredible, and he makes it relatively digestible for things that are insanely complex and hard to explain. Um, so yeah,
Yeah,
that's what.
there's also a relatively obscure book called LSD and the Creative Process that was written by Dr. Oscar Janiger, and it was one of the only scientific studies that I know of that explored the influence of psychedelics on creativity, primarily visual artists, and it's pretty interesting. They gave like 75 artists LSD and they had them create artworks while they were high on LSD, and it's interesting, and it's a totally conservative collegial academic scientific study upon the effects of LSD on the creative process. But I would love to see that study replicated now. That's one of the old glory days of psychedelic research studies that hasn't been revitalized, and I would love to see that study replicated now.
I mean, I think the steps and the blocks are there, especially with most governments approving, psilocybin research. I think that it's a stepping stone back to realizing the innate therapeutic effects. Um, and yeah, of course, what that can have for collective consciousness and healing and everything else that good creation brings to the world and society.
Yeah, but
Wishful
unfortunately
thinking.
unfortunately creativity and the arts aren't really high on the totem pole when it comes to government funding. So it's like there's a lot of other things we're using psychedelics to study first, especially it's the curative potential for PTSD is probably the biggest motivator.
Yeah. Yep. Um, One of the interesting things about the study that Dr. Robin Carhart did was that he had, because all of this research was like anecdotal that he did with these people, and he had them rate the experience on how profound it was in relation to their other life events. And many of the participants that saw a blood flow decrease to the default mode network, which is the dissolution of ego, or they think that's what it is, um, they rated it as either as profound or more profound than things like childbirth.
Mm.
Um, so just really high, like medicinal experiences, profound and terrifying for a lot of these people. Um, but just like talking about um, what specifically is happening and how to kind of measure that, because we don't know. It's all just theory and then anecdote.
Mm. Cool.
But yeah, I mean, if that's all the questions.
I think somebody asked where can we hear more podcasts. I'm going to be doing some podcasts this week. I'm doing one tomorrow with Monica Dogra, who's a powerful Indian musical artist, and doing one on Sunday with a friend named Camya. And yeah, I'll be doing podcasts pretty regularly live. So check those out if you want to hear more podcasts.
Yeah, I'm gonna be doing a few interviews. I don't normally go live, but I might see if I can do some more of these on live. I don't know. I don't know who else I'm quite interviewing yet. I have a few people lined
Cool.
up. So
Yeah, well, maybe we can do this again another time.
yeah, that'd be fun. Come up with a new topic.
Sure.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Jake.
All right. Much love. Be well.
Yep.
See you soon.
Bye, guys.